so much, sir. So I am Gauri Garg, a senior editor at The Probe, and I'm joined by my fellow associate editor, Riddhi. We are a student-run, non-partisan magazine started back in 2020 by Caucus, the Discussion and Deliberation Forum of Hindu College. Caucus functions as the 16-year-old mini think tank of the college, and we opine on various issues ranging from politics, law, economics, history, and so forth. For our viewers, today we are joined by a distinguished Indian economist, Professor Amit Bhaduri, who is widely recognized for his pioneering contributions to development economics, a former professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University and several leading global institutions. He has authored numerous influential works, including The Economic Structure of Backward Agriculture and The Face You Were Afraid to See. His research bridges economics with social and political realities, offering powerful insights into inequality, development, and democracy. On behalf of the entire team at Probe, we would like to show our gratitude to you, sir, for joining us today. So, we would like to begin with the interview, and I would request Riddhi to start with the conversation.
All right, let's start with your book, The Face You Were Afraid to See. You critique the over reliance on GDP as a measure of economic success. For starters, could you elaborate on how this narrow focus on GDP growth affects marginalized communities and non market aspects of well being? Do you foresee any political resistance from stakeholders invested in the GDP based framework?
Well,
Right, sir.
the usual criticism, even you might call the internal criticism within standard economics, conventional economics, nowadays of GDP is some important omissions, things which it has omitted. The first and most important is contribution of women, unpaid labor of women. Now, there have been some attempts to include it, as you know, and it estimates vary in countries between 30 to 60% of GDP, but it's a huge amount. And the second element is the what you call the environment, or the not including the our environment as a part of the GDP. And there is, for example, a book by this man, who also got a Nobel Prize, Nordhaus. Nordhaus and Samuelson had their revised textbook in which they tried to give an estimate, because Nordhaus was very interested in environmental issues. And similarly, I have some friends, women professors and so on, who have also given estimates of GDP in America. Now, these are the two major omissions. I mean, there are also other omissions, but these are the two major omissions in GDP measurement. That is the narrow focus. But my focus, as the question, I think the questionnaire which you sent, as somebody had asked me, is in, I think it is in that book, The Face You Are Afraid to See. My basic criticism was, it does not include what your question directly asks, that it does not include the inequality. I mean, one way of saying, for example, the gender issue or the environment issue is not as something separate, but these are as, if you're a marginalized community, living, say, for example, in Bastar area, your well-being doesn't count in a way, and therefore the environmental equality does not count. You can do it that way. And the second is, similarly with women, until very recently it was a completely, what shall I say, almost whatever you call it, because of patriarchy, because of our culture, whatever it is, not only in India but all over the world. It was never assumed to be worth considering. I remember, I think it is also in his book, but I remember one conversation with a well-known economist, John Hicks, who did a national income accounting. And I had asked him, I think he had come to India, or I can't remember, it was in Oxford. that he gave this famous example that if a housewife is in the, joins as a typist, she adds to national income. But if she becomes a housewife, there is a reduction in national income because it does not count. So, I mean, he gave this example, but he did not generalize or he did not see its full significance. And this is what, to a large extent, is considered. I mean, if you think of the whole women's question as to some extent as a kind of marginalization of women, then this was a part of the answer to your question, how things are. But my basic focus was not on the gender issue. I mean, so far as I'm concerned, but because I was interested in land acquisition and so on, I was much more interested in the issue of inequality as it is in India. And very simply, it's, my famous example, which many people also started recording. If you take a slave economy, and if you have 10 people with 100 each, it's a 1000 GDP. But if you take the same 1000, give one to each slave, and the rest, all the 990 to one person, then it is also GDP is 1000, but it does not mean the same thing at all. And it's this kind of issues I was much more concerned with. I think, well, you also asked me in that question, as I see, that is there any opposition by some stakeholders? I mean, what is the vested interest in it and what is the vested? Well, as I see it, there are two elements of this. One element is the whole orthodox standard economics, which continues to matter GDP, well-being, and everything in terms of per capita income and so on. I mean, a little bit extended by, longevity, so on and so forth, by the UN. But basically, it is the stakeholders' interest to let GDP measure continue as it is, and a growth in GDP, an increment in GDP, measured in this way, is what is treated as success or failure. I mean, if you have a 10% GDP growth, it's a success. If you have a 2% increment in GDP, it's not so much of a success. Minus 2% is a failure. Now, this obviously is not true either in terms of if your focus is in income distribution, if your focus is environment, if your focus is unpaid work for women. In many of these cases, it can mean an increase. But I mean, if you look at, for example, whether it is our, what we call Economic Advisory Council or standard economic lectures and so on, this is not considered. So its biggest fallout, as you as students of economists, and I think in some of the questions also, I see this vaguely represented. Keep on, I mean, you are sort of brainwashed or you are sort of completely exposed to one particular idea, and that is unless other things are assumed equal and GDP growth is better. In your practical experience, you begin to see this is not true. You begin to see that Adani and Ambani, I mean, to come to getting more money does not mean that the economy is growing. The stock market doing well means at the maximum, top 5% of Indian population have some benefit from it. But it does not mean anything but the economy. But this is the vested interest. That, and therefore you think it is much better, right now around Delhi, that to be able to have a second airport or to have faster roads, highways and so on, is far more important than, say, what shall I say, long, say, for example, reducing the death rate of children below 6 years, or bringing into equality the death rate of boys and girls, not having drinking water. I mean, you never see them discussed. They're invisible. And this is the stakeholder interest.
Right. So, since you also mentioned about the stakeholder interest and how the state is essentially required to provide these facilities to the public, so referencing Robert L. Heilbronner here, as he says in The Nature and Logic of Capitalism, that there exists a conflict between the two logics of power under capitalism, the economic and political. So, the masking of functions of the capitalist and the state, and the characteristic tension in the political nature of capitalism essentially ensures that neither the state nor the economy can exist by itself, and neither do they have the capacity to endanger each other. So, how does this tension manifest itself in the context of the Indian economy today?
You mean that it is neither the, sorry, you mean the second question, that it is neither the state or the economy can keep
Right,
exist in
right,
itself.
right,
Well, let me go back to a little bit of, what shall I say, how it has been classically discussed and so on. There is a very famous book. I don't know if you ever come across this in your lectures and so on, probably not, by the sort of historian, economist, sociologist, whatever you like to call him, Karl Polanyi. Do you know the name? Polanyi. It is called the Great Transformation. I think one of the best books in economics to understand, written in the 1940s about capitalism. Polanyi gave the example, and I start with this as a background. He said that, you see, there is, in his words, there is a double movement. There is between the state, or what you call the political aspect, and the economic aspect. When you have too much going on the economic aspect, say for example growth of GDP, to link to the earlier question, you have too much emphasis on production, economic benefit, don't consider at all about distribution and so on. When you move in that direction, a success of capitalism depends on whether you call it success or movement of capitalism depends on countering it by moving in the opposite direction. You have laws. The classic example is Marx. I mean, you have child exploitation of labor, long hours of labor. People talk about, this is not the way to develop a country because, children are, this is in industrial, first stage of industrialization in England, that people are children are made to work for 14 hours a day, 16 hours a day. This is not development. It was not only Marx, lots of people were writing at that time. Now, then you have a movement in the other direction, that you have a restriction on the amount child labor, number of hours for which a labor works, which we now take for granted. 8 hours of work in a standard, factory work and so on, or 10 hours of work in a standard factory work. But that there should be a limit. But you see, it did not fall from the heaven. I mean, this is what Polanyi was basically, in exact, precise terms, was meaning. That you do not move, you go to the economics on the one hand, that growth depends on exploitation of labor, let's say. Then you move to the other side, that this is not true, this will. And as one of the later questions also asks, this is equally true of trade unionism. In our century or last century, Galbraith talked about it, that capitalist movement is always this, in his different words, that it is always, I mean, you have too much of exploitation, then you have labor which grows, which sets up the wage, and thereby you have some sort of a balance, you restore the balance to some extent between capital and labor. Now, this double movement of capitalism, to use Polanyi's jargon, this double movement has been, I think, always this, what shall I say, the underlying element of almost all capitalist societies as we know it now. I mean, it did not come from heaven, it gradually evolved, it is still evolving, but this is how it started. To take an example, futurist example, when today you talk about artificial intelligence and so on, you have the same thing. Artificial intelligence, it will take away a lot of jobs. So what do we do? Minimum income. I mean, one solution. I don't agree with it, but one solution given by many people. This is the same thing. That the challenge is, this is the technology, this is the exploitation, this is, in one way it will develop, we have to do it the other way. This is the double movement, and I think this is what you mean by politics and economics being counterposed. Now, in our society, in capitalist democracies, if I talk of capitalist democracies, in capitalist democracies, basically, this manifests itself all the time, and it has been known all the time as the conflict between the logic of the market and the logic of democracy. If you talk about adult democracy, one adult, one vote, or one person, one vote, and as opposed to this, as Samuelson and so on orthodox economics would say, $1, one vote. Now, the obvious solution for this, and which over time, I mean, if you look at it the most obvious way, the solution is a much greater equality of income. If one person, one vote, then give every person the same amount of dollars so that they have the equal weight in politics and economics. This was the crux of social democracy. Social democracy in Scandinavia, as it was, in the 1920s, 30s, at least developed as one of the best forms of capitalism. I mean, in terms of both results and in terms of what it did for society. Started by people like Gunnar Myrdal and so on. It was this idea, the conflict between, the logic of the market and the logic of the, one person, one vote. These two could be more or less reconciled by the state giving a considerable amount of weight to equality of income, not allowing equality of income to become too bad. Again, this is the same double movement. You don't discover new things. You keep on saying the same things in different ways for different historical contexts. But social democracy was trying to say the same thing, that, if you move too much in one direction, we would not allow this. The state's role is to keep this in a certain way. Now, and this is what is meant by, in your question, the endangered. If you go too much, this is precisely what it means. If you go too much in one direction, capitalist democracies as we know it gets then endangered. Donald Trump endangers democracy not only because he is of a fascist views in terms of race and so on, women, race, and all the other things, but it is also simply because if he does not recognize this role of the state, then it is endangering of your democracy. I leave it to you to say that, this is why it rings a bell when you say that the Adani is going unchallenged by, for example, SEBI, you know, that SEBI is meant to, was, you know what is SEBI? SEBI was meant to control to a certain extent work as a regulator so far as corporations are concerned. Now, if SEBI does not do it, and it has not done it so far, certainly so far as Adani is concerned, then it is this kind of endangering of democracy that we face. And this is, I think, was what was really the crux of the problem of being endangered. That is, in the context of the Indian economy, the biggest problem. I think I should tell you one thing in this context, which is again something which is obvious, like all that I am saying is quite obvious, but which is not usually seen. You see, this notion of a capitalist democracy, am I clearly can you understand me what I'm saying very clearly? Or
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
you? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. You see, capitalist democracy in Indian context has several particular aspects. We'll come to some of them, but this is the fundamental issue, that to what extent you can create this double movement, check and balance and so on. If you have, and most of the one-party democracies or so-called socialist countries do not have it at all. So in one way they are more successful, in another way they are total failure, because they go one way or the other, and this double movement is not a part of the system, rightly or wrongly. But if you take our kind of country, our kind of system, I think one of the problems which I should tell you is when you read development economics as students, when you are lectured or you read development economics and so on and so forth, you should know how this links with this. The precise link lies in who carries out the development, the investment strategy, the development strategy of the society. You see, till about, let's say, mid 80s or early 80s, certainly, till about mid 80s, it was the state. More or less, if you ask any economist of my generation, right wing or left wing or whatever it is, they would start by saying that the state and what the state invests and so on. This changed with liberalization. One of the biggest change of liberalization was when you ask me about the stakeholders and how Indian economy today, the whole ideology became investment is carried out by the private sector and now more increasingly by two or three large corporations. More exactly, two large corporations. You see, this change, whether you agree or disagree is another matter, but this change is the change in a total shift from the state to the other thing. You see, people usually talk a lot. I mean, if you hear people talking on YouTube and this, that, you'll hear, but you know, after all, what is the biggest income generation, or rather, how is the Indian economy growing? Obviously, it is not growing to a large extent. Probably you have been told it in the class, or any amount of statistics would show you in India, that it is basically still by public investment, and it is in infrastructure largely. Whatever growth India is getting, it is infrastructure. But on this infrastructure, based on this infrastructure, further growth is done by the corporations, because it becomes a way of helping the corporations. So you develop, let's say you develop airports, you develop, I mean, look at actual examples. You develop airports, you develop ports. All these are sounding like Adani. I'm criticizing Adani, which I am, but it's literally these kind of, almost these investments. You develop that, you have to develop, what do you call, virtual economy, much more. Now, each one of these, you will say corporate interest linked to it. But who is carrying out still the basic investment in this? That is where the puzzle is. The basic investment for this, both the success and the failure, belongs to the state. But if it succeeds, most of the benefit is reaped by the corporations. And this is the name of the game which is going on in India today. It's not a question of simply whether I agree or disagree, but it is basically a way of, developing in a certain way a risk-free capitalism, of the private sector. And in extreme cases, this is of course also true of, most obviously, of banks. If you take money like they do, and if you're an Adani or an Ambani and you are unable to pay back, if that thing fails, it is just written off as non-performing asset.
Right, so
Moving
that was very insightful. So yes, moving towards Ritina.
Moving from a conflict that was between two logics of power under capitalism, let's move to another heated and vibrant debate, that is Cambridge Capital controversy.
Yes, I saw it. A lot of stands out. Probably because you read my CV or something, and you thought you must ask me something.
As someone who closely observed this controversy after nearly 7 decades since this controversy occurred, what reflections do you have on the same? How do you observe the attempts by mainstream economists to decry the heterodox stance in the dispute, such as when Paul Romer said that Joan Robinson was engaged in academic politics when she waged her campaign against capital and the aggregate production function.
Well, Paul Romer, whom I know a little bit, is certainly right, but he is also doing same. I mean, you cannot do economics without certain kind of political stance. So it's a nonsense, to say. Of course, Joan Robinson had a political stance. So did Milton Friedman. So did Paul Samuelson. So do I. So do you. If you become professional economist. So it's a non-statement in a way. But let us not get into stupidities. Let me talk about the substantial part. I don't deny that Joan Robinson has a political stance. I don't deny that Milton Friedman had a political stance. I don't deny that Manmohan Singh had a political stance. Everybody has a political stance. You can't do economics without a political stance. Honesty lies in making the political stance clearer. That, and so you must separate the question which Joan Robinson asked from her dislike of capitalism, or Milton Friedman's many questions about, say, for example, speculation and so on. We are not going to get into this. From his political stance of being very pro-market and so on, very pro-capitalist, from the questions which he asks. I mean, this is one of the, if you want, this is one of the real trainings in economics. Since you mentioned Joan Robinson was both an economist whom I knew well, and she was a personal friend. So let me just repeat something she said. She said, economics is a very important, this quote? That economics, somehow she said, economics is a very important subject. Why? Not because what it teaches you, but it teaches you not to be fooled by other economists. You learn to be, and I think, the longer I live, the wisdom of a statement like this, I see much more, And that is why I say it is not only Joan Robinson or Milton Friedman or Paul Samuelson. It is rubbish to say that, this is, like many leftists also say, many Marxists also say, that this is, capitalist ranting, or this is, Marxist ranting. like Paul Romer is saying. Everybody is ranting in that sense. It's a political, And the point is to know the difference between the two. What is the question and how a particular person with his or her bias answers the question. Now, what is the central question in capital theory? I did this is something in which I spent almost my best years of my life, rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly. But when I was doing my PhD in Cambridge, because it was the raging controversy at that time, the first papers I wrote and published, if you ever have a look, you will see the first, I can't remember, several papers which I wrote at that time were on capital theory controversy. Everybody was writing, I was also writing. But the capital theory, essentially what is it all about? Why do people still talk about it? The unorthodox economists talk about it more. The orthodox economists talk about it less. But why doesn't the question go away? There are two reasons for this. The first reason is a purely and very simple reason, which is that the capital theory debate was completely won by those who were asking the same kind of question as Joan Robinson or Pierre de Straffa. If you want somebody who was totally against it, that is Paul Samuelson. He had an article, I think, in Quarterly Journal of Economics, 1966. I must say he was a remarkably honest economist, Samuelson. Whatever you think of him as an economist, he was a remarkably honest economist because he actually accepted, like Joan Robinson, he accepted that the question, logically the answer went in favor of Cambridge economists completely. And he ended by, I think, his essay by saying something like, to be an academic is not an easy life because you have to accept when you make a mistake. And I think this is also something which Joan Robinson said about imperfect competition, which made her a famous economist. Towards the end of her life, she used to say many times that, well, that was nonsense what I did. This imperfect competition and this various classification which you read in, because it gets you nowhere. Anyway, what is the main question of capital theory? One way of seeing it is if you think in terms of capital as capital, labor and land or whatever it is, the basic neoclassical idea, the basic idea which I think is true since Ricardo's theory of rent, and it is certainly true, it is certainly the cornerstone, neoclassical economics of any form, whether it is Arrow de Brue, general equilibrium, or it is capital labor of simple macroeconomics. The basic idea is scarcity determines the value of a commodity. You read any textbook, standard textbook, and they will say that scarcity is relative scarcity is if the price of banana is more than the price of apple, it is because banana is more scarce than apple, or for that matter, if diamond is more expensive than coal, it is not because coal has a higher use value and diamond has a lower use value, but diamond is scarce and coal is less scarce, right? All along it runs through. Capital labor substitution, the same thing. What you do, the basic K by L ratio determining the relative price of capital and labor is what? Relative price of capital vis-a-vis how scarce is capital vis-a-vis labor. Capital theory, we all basically know this. What capital theory pointed out is that you cannot define the scarcity value of something called capital because you cannot measure it. That is what it's saying. Now, very often, if you ask somebody who doesn't understand capital theory, would say, not that it's, but it's a half true answer. They would say that, well, you cannot measure anything. You cannot measure, I mean, I remember one statistician told me that this is true. You cannot even measure electricity, a homogeneous thing as electricity, because there are fine differences in it and so on, which time of the day. This is true. But in principle, like in everything, in principle, there is a measurement which is possible. That is, if there is a definition of a measurable concept, that in principle I can define a theoretical system in which it is possible to measure it. Now, so far as this question is concerned, whether you can measure capital or not depends on the same thing. What was shown in the capital theory debate is you cannot measure capital without getting into circular reasoning. That is, there is no way you can measure capital, whether you think of John Robinson's book, John Robinson, or you think of Piero Sraffa, or you think of Samuelson, or you think of the Austrians, Baumbach and so on. In all these cases, to measure capital, you require the rate of profit. For example, if you want to measure a machine, how do you measure a machine? If you measure it, you have to measure it in terms of its present value. If you want to measure a stock, present value measurement requires one. You must know some rate of interest, some rate of discount at which you take the present value of a profit stream. Now, if you have to take an interest, and if that interest becomes your marginal productivity of capital, you are in a circular reasoning. This is what it was saying, and in a slightly different way, but in a much more sophisticated way, Piero Sraffa's production of commodities by means of commodities, I don't know if you know the book, showed the same thing. That it showed that actually you don't start by measuring capital. What has happened? Something has gone into. Now, one of the things, as I said, that if you want to value a machine, you have to know its profit stream, and the profit stream can be measured only with a rate of interest, and that rate of interest is used to measure the machine's value of capital, and this value is its marginal productivity of capital. So the conflict is between the value of capital and capital as an stock of commodities. Joan Robinson did not use mathematics, but all the time she was, in different ways, she was saying the same thing. That if you think of it as a, produce means of production, what you read one of the first lectures in economics, capital is produce means of production. It's a lot of machines, it's a lot of raw materials, so on and so forth. Now, these you cannot measure without knowing the rate of profit, except in a one commodity world. If you have the one commodity world, there the stock of capital is the same thing. Is, let us say, corn, the flow of the new corns produced every year is the flow and the stock. Now, Sraffa showed the same thing, and that kind of, and Leontief, who was not interested in capital theory debate, did the same thing by looking at, now on this capital theory debate, what Sraffa did was to show the same thing, but when capital is just any kind of commodities. I mean, you take various commodities. I don't know if you have done input-output table or national income accounting and so on. You take different you require corn to produce steel, you require steel to produce corn, and so on and so forth. You have not a unidirectional, this you must know, probably your teachers don't tell you. you don't have a unidirectional production system. That is the Austrians and the neoclassicals. The Austrians are called neoclassicals, a particular version of neoclassicals for the same reason. Because there, from input, you have basic inputs from which you go to the output. Okay? Leontief, Sraffa, then the mathematician von Neumann, they all were talking about systems which are not unidirectional, which are circular. You require steel to produce, you require capital to produce capital, you require capital to produce labor, to produce commodity, and you require commodities to produce other kinds of capital. This circularity, and Sraffa showed the same thing, that if you assume this circularity, if you represent the production system as a circular process, you must remember that he discovered it in the 1920s, when none of this thing existed at all. And he was just secretively working on this and not showing it to anybody, except 2 or 3 people. But he discovered that the same thing held with capital. Unless you define the rate of profit first, you could not have you could not value these different commodities. You could only value them, and if you want to value them, you already know the rate of profit. This is the circularity of the rate of profit, and it is accepted by everybody. Since you mentioned Romer, I will mention another economist. What is his name? A neoclassical economist, who the rational expectation guy. You remember the name? Lucas, who was one of the first. Now, Lucas was the one who also gave a lecture. And he actually was a bit more honest. He said this is true. What the Cambridge people say is true. But the only way we can represent the, macroeconomic system is by assuming something like capital. That is basically a one commodity world. So you see, in one sense, he was right. And if you have any taste for philosophy or any taste for something which is outside economics, let me just say one small thing and I will stop. You see, there was early in the 19th century, early in the 20th century, 1905-6, when probably the most important center of sort of all kinds of abstract knowledge was Vienna. Many of the best mathematicians, best physicists, all of them came from Vienna. When they discovered a particular way of thinking, or they systematized a particular way of thinking, which is called logical positivism. Now, logical positivism basically meant that, and which Friedman is one of his biggest followers, his book, important book which most people know, Essays in Positive Economics. The positive economics come from the word logical positivism. Logical positivism said that, we use many concepts. This is to take you something beyond, what stupidity of Romer or so on and so forth. That logical positivism basically said that, you can use an economic system where you have non-observables. Okay. Like in economics, you can use utility. It's not an observable commodity. You can use capital in more than one commodity world, which is not an observable commodity. But you still consider it as a part of your, what shall I say, theory, because you use this to derive results which are observable. The extreme case of this in modern case is quantum mechanics. Much of quantum mechanics, the wave, particles, so on and so forth, they are not measurable until you have observed it. But they make some predictions, and these predictions work. And that is why you say the theory is workable. This is basically logical positivism. And this is how actually experimental sciences proceed. Now, in economics, which is not quite an experimental science, can you proceed in the same way? I mean, I don't know the answer. But I think you see capital theory at a bigger philosophical level, to me at least, and I suppose to some many other people, raises this rather, undecidable question. You see that many of the predictions which you get from capital theory, I mean, if you assume that y is equal to f and k, function of capital and labor, and you use your standard, churn out your standard textbook results, many of the results are observable and turn out to be true. Many of the results are observable, but unlike in physics, turn out to be not true. There is no way you revise the theory. That is where economics differs from subjects like physics or subjects like chemistry or any physical science. You have no iteration by which this is done. So that is why I said Romer's thing is so stupid, because it is not a question of whether what Robinson said is political or not political. The real issue is, can we work with a system where we do not know how to correct it, at least in theory? Okay.
Right. So that was very insightful given the whole.
But am I saying, is it, can you understand what I mean?
Yes, sir. Because I have heard of these theories before briefly since we've been introduced to a new paper this semester, but I feel like given the whole new education policy, we actually never get the time to delve into the theorists and their works and actually understand the entire thing. So I think this was very insightful personally for me, given the fact that we are getting introduced to some of these theorists just this semester. So yes.
Okay. I mean,
Uh,
because if you don't understand, just raise your hand if you don't want to interrupt me.
sure, sir. Sure, sir.
Because
So,
I might be just talking away from you or talking over you or talking under you. I don't know which one. But okay.
right. So, sir, moving on. So the hegemony of Western academia is basically deeply rooted in its economic prowess, which is attributed to endogenous reasons, wherein the emergence of modern capitalist institutions is but the final milestone towards the end of history, which is basically constituted by a globalized capitalist order. And the recent Nobel Prize in Economics awarded some of the leading new institutional economists who argued for a similar theory wherein inclusive institutions are the prime mover of economic growth and development, and they end up minimizing the colonial, imperial, extraction, and trade protectionism. Uh, what reflections do you have on the new institutional economists and their theory of growth? Uh, Theoretically, when seen through the lens of theories such as substantivism, and empirically when contrasted with East Asia and other regions.
Well, this is really from capital theory jumping into a rather different area, and but it is in a way it is the similar thing, that how much politics comes in, hegemony and politics comes in. Well, you see about this recent prize is actually a, how shall I put it? I mean, the prize is not important, but what is really the issue in any economic history which you do is what Gunnar Myrdal said in his Asian drama. He said it, he took about 100 pages to say it, which is not necessary. But it is an important question. What is your starting point? If you are going to make a theory, what is your starting point? What they miss out, very simply, it is not so much hegemony and so on. There is a certain way in which, and which is more or less agreed, in which almost everywhere, what we call today's capitalist countries, if you leave out the more recent, South Korea and China and so on and so forth, the way in which capitalism started. How did capitalism start? I think the best shorthand description of this is still Marx, and the jargon or term for this is primitive accumulation. Marx took the example of England. Much of his theory was based on the English economic history and the development of capitalism in England. And then other people sort of added other parts to it and so on. But one of the most important things which he says, and which actually is forgotten by many people, including by Marxists and so on, in later discussions, is there is something called primitive accumulation. The jargon is primitive accumulation. Marx says that this primitive accumulation in British capitalism started with the, I don't know whether you read it in economic history or anything like this, it started with the enclosure movement. That is, all land used to be owned by the crown in principle, by the emperor in principle, in a sovereign country, whether it is England or it is India under Akbar or anybody. But the actual use right to land, this was in principle the ownership right. The use right to land was free. Whoever cultivated the land actually got the produce of the land until the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement, with the sort of slightly richer capitalists and people who are closer to the crown and closer to power, what they did is they enclosed the land. That is why it is called the enclosure movement. They enclosed the land. Again, I don't know whether I'm talking over your head or under. You know all this or you don't. Now, do you know all this? Have you read all this in lectures?
So I have started delving into Marxian theory a bit in economic history, since we have that this semester, but not in its entirety, but just the beginning of it, from
Okay.
feudalism and the whole transition, basically.
Okay. The beginning of the sort of capitalism which they talk about was the enclosure movement, which actually established private property rights on land. That is, even though the superior right belonged to the king, even today, it belongs to the state in every country. But the actual right, the ownership right, as well as the use right, was given to the person who would have the property right to land. Okay? This was the establishment of the property right which they are talking about. Okay? And their mistake or their serious omission, which makes their theory so biased, is they simply came to the conclusion like this because they forgot this primitive accumulation part of history. You see, before this whole thing could be started, when somebody from America interviewed me, I said it, they treated on the same thing. They treated the whole thing as a clean slate. That in America they came They set up property right, but they were property rights. The property rights are communal property rights. The property rights are that, like in England, the property right was the property right of the whoever used the land, or which were community, the community which used the land, the property belonged to them. Private property right, in the sense which you see in America, was set up by them. And they did not set it up by, what should I say, they did not set it up by on a clean slate, on a blank sheet. First, there were genocides. To put it very simply, there were genocides. Like right now, it is, some people would like to do it in Gaza. That you simply clean up the area so that you can fashion it in the way, set up property rights and so on in the way you want it. The second mistake which they make, and the first mistake is one of omission, that they don't mention this part of the precondition for setting up private property rights. That there were property rights of a different sort earlier, and you had to demolish it completely, like in Congo, their famous example, to set it up. When you could not do it because they were an old established civilization or society, which you could not completely get rid of, like in India, like in Vietnam, so on and so forth, with colonial power came. They actually set up a legal property rights system which is side by side with this. I mean, in India, there were, you see, in England, in the country from where it all started, you had the same thing, customary law. What is customary law? Law which existed before private property right, which came from customs. Same in India. What is Hindu, what is called undivided property right? On which there is some of the Muslim rights to several marriages. What are these rights? These are customary rights. Now, if you want to set up some other right, you have to, some are good, some are bad. That is not what we are discussing. But the whole idea that you had no property right, and they came on a clean slate and they set up property rights. In some places, they could not set up property rights because already complex societies existed, which the colonial powers like the British in India or the French in Indonesia were unable to completely get rid of or did not want to get rid of. They found some other way, and these did not become settlers' colonies. The credit I give them is they found some very interesting instrumental variable test, which is you see, if you correlate two things, you don't know which one is which. Okay, you don't know the cause and effect, they are the association. They took, and if you have not read them, their best book is their best piece of work. Much of it is junk, but their best piece of work is something which is not this Mexico and America, which except is again totally confusing because it's two systems with property rights are not established and so on, exactly for the kind of confusion which they have. But their best example is Congo, where they found out, it is in the American Economic Review, if I remember, 2001 or something like that, from which their whole thing actually started. And they simply found out, and the paper was published, the paper I saw in a draft form in 1990s, where they found, took from parish record, from the church record, they saw that Congo, the average lifespan was about 26 years. So if you came to Congo as a young man, women did not come, so I say young man. If you came as a young man, around the age of 23, 24 to Congo, a Belgian, your life expectancy was very low. And therefore you decided to an extractive economy. And they show a correlation between the extraction, the being a very extractive kind of institutions, and longevity, expected lifetime from the church record. And because expected lifetime is a completely outside variable, is an instrumental variable, the correlation was, it was an interesting idea. But if you go back to the same thing and you think of India, closer home, the British came, won the Battle of Plassey, and 1779. But you see, India was already an established power. It is true. Their theory works to a certain extent. The East India Company was mostly extractive, but they were extractive they were extractive through trade. The institutions they used is international trade. They continued to use international trade even when you come much later. In many cases, they did not serve, and this is a point they completely miss. And I think this is a much more important thing, whether it is the countries like China, where the Opium War took place and so on. Trade and free trade became far more important than the simple idea of property, private property rights. They completely miss the point. And that is why they completely miss that aspect of development of capitalism. In India, the drain theory and all the rest of it, imperialism. Imperialism largely worked through what? First, by trying to demolish property rights. Before they could set up any property rights. Where they could not demolish the property rights, they set it up. They circumvented it very often through free trade. And I think, much better than them, who understood the system, is this writer, Amitabh Ghosh. If you read Amitabh Ghosh, you will see that when he talks of Opium War or his very recent book and so on, repeatedly he keeps on saying this. He's a novelist, so he does not say it so like us in such a mundane fashion, prosaic fashion. But basically he was trying to get at this idea. So, the property right, there are property rights and property rights. If you look at property rights as free trade, which, for example, Jagdish Bhagwati, why do you call him a rather liberal economist? Very liberal economist, my old colleague. When I first taught in Delhi University. I taught in Delhi School of Economics when I first came back from Cambridge. And then I was the first one to leave Delhi School of Economics, was also the next year. After, I think 1968, 69. I taught in Delhi School of Economics and I was the youngest professor there. But anyway, this is precisely what is missed in the theory of imperialism. That private property, establishing private property in their sense of the term, is not what imperialism is all about, or exploitation of one country by another is all about. Exploitation of one country by another and extractive systems versus, whatever they call it, the supportive systems and so on, is actually not simply a matter of climate, not simply a matter of geography or longevity and so on, but there are different ways in which you can do it. And not to understand this, I gave you the most important example of this is free trade. Today it is liberalization, and today it is globalization. history in a certain way repeats itself, but with different digits. And it is the same thing, that when you say that we require, some people say we require globalization. You will see in the extreme, make everything free, make freedom of capital movement. Then Western countries would say, yes, it's freedom of capital movement, but not freedom of labor. Some people would say freedom of labor and capital, if you are a real extreme liberal. And this, what is the, how do you use market to use exploitation is not captured by their story of private property. And that is what makes it a lame theory. And that is where, everything is ideological. What I am telling you is also ideological. But I think if you're honest enough, you understand this. And their ideology is the ideology which is particularly favored, very understandably, by the Swedish National Bank. You don't expect the Swedish National Bank to be very sympathetic to radical economists. It is nonsense. It is like expecting Narendra Modi to be very favorable to me. Okay.
I believe this was the last question from our side due to paucity of time.